All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is the Tea Party movement. And also we're going to talk about Astroturfs as well, which are fake grassroots movements. And we're going to talk about whether the Tea Party was a true grassroots movement or an AstroTurf or somewhere in between. But it's important that we talk about it, even though that a lot of people, particularly a lot of the Tea Party politicians like Rand Paul recently said the Tea Party's dead. At the same time, even though we don't see Tea Party rallies anymore, their influence, a lot of their narratives, a lot of their influence is still felt today, particularly around the support for Trump, but also around the push for more extreme, conservative policies and politicians. So I think it's important that we understand, how the Tea Party was created, how it was influenced, and then how it's still kind of pushing perspectives and policies today. Okay, first I want to start off. Slate has a real quick history of the Tea Party in 4 minutes. It's going to kind of give us a baseline to work with as we kind of dive a little bit deeper into different types, parts of the history and throughout this section.
In case you haven't been paying attention, here's everything you need to know about the Tea Party in 4 minutes. February 2009, Obama signs the $787 billion stimulus package. The same week, Kelly Carrinder, teacher and blogger, aka Liberty Bell, stages a Porculus rally in Seattle to protest government spending. 120 people attend. Conservative blogger Michelle Malkin writes about the event. Sends pulled pork. 3 days later, CNBC's Rick Santelli unleashes an epic rant from the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade.
How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening? We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
Within hours, the rant gets over 1 million views. Within days, Tea Party sites and Facebook groups spring up around the country. February 27th, thousands attend rallies across the country in 48 cities, like the original Tea Party, without the Whigs. March 13th, Glenn Beck introduces the 9/12 movement, becomes a Tea Party rallying point.
You're not alone.
April 12th, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman calls the Tea Party movement AstroTurf, as opposed to grassroots. Says it draws backing from established conservative groups. April 15th, Tea Partiers and Fox News promote tax day rallies across the country.
This is real. These people are here, and they're here to stay.
Fox runs wall-to-wall coverage. Message: if you stage it, we will come. A memo passed around the rallies informs activists to reject the term teabaggers. Liberals go nuts with the puns.
It's going to be teabagging day for the right wing, and they're going nuts for it.
The White House shifts focus from stimulus to healthcare reform. So does the Tea Party. Happy 4th. Over 250 Tea Party groups rally at local congressional offices. Message: Obamacare equals socialized medicine. Members of Congress return home for recess and healthcare town halls. Tea Party hecklers disrupt meetings in Florida and Massachusetts and Washington State. September 12th. 75,000 people turn out for the Taxpayer March on Washington. Glenn Beck crows. Fox News claims the competition barely covered the rally. CNN responds. Plays footage of a Fox producer pumping up the crowd. Fox backs down. Disciplines the producer. December. Healthcare bill stalled in Congress. Dispute breaks out over a racist sign held up by one Tea Party leader. He's condemned by other leaders. Nobody likes the N-word. More anti-Obama signs surface. He's the devil, the Joker, an Arab terrorist, Hitler. The left takes umbrage. The movement says it's just fringe elements. Happy New Year. Tea Party turns from healthcare to electing like-minded candidates. January 19th. Tea Party-backed Republican Scott Brown wins Ted Kennedy's Senate seat in Massachusetts, offers a non sequitur in his victory speech.
I rely on Gail's love and support and that of our two lovely daughters. Just in case anybody who's watching throughout the country, yes, they're both available.
2 weeks later, the Tea Party holds its first national convention. Tickets cost $549. True believers balk at the price tag. Sarah Palin doesn't care. Collects $100,000 for speaking to a small crowd. March 20th. Healthcare protest in Washington. A black congressman claims Tea Partiers yelled the N-word at him. There's no video proof. April 14th. A New York Times poll of Tea Partiers shows they're older, whiter, wealthier, and angrier than the general population. Surprise, surprise. Summer campaign trail. The Tea Party claims several key primary victories. Rand Paul, Sharon Angle, Ken Buck, Marco Rubio, Joe Miller, and Christine O'Donnell win GOP Senate nominations. Carl Palladino wins the nomination for New York governor.
The people have had enough.
Then the gaffes begin.
You send another goon to my daughter's house and they'll take you out, buddy.
Some of you look a little more Asian to me. I don't know that.
Why should you vote for me? Because I do not wear high heels.
September. O'Donnell becomes the poster girl for Tea Party Inexperience. Embarrassing video clips surface.
I dabbled into witchcraft. I never joined a coven.
She responds.
I'm not a witch. I'm you.
Her response gets auto-tuned.
I'm you. I'm not a witch. None of us are perfect.
All told, over 150 Tea Party endorsed candidates are running for Congress. Election night. Rand Paul and Marco Rubio win Senate seats. Ken Buck, Christine O'Donnell, and Sharon Angle go down. The Tea Party claims dozens of seats in the House and a handful in the Senate. Trifold hats and powdered wigs are coming to Washington. But the GOP old guard may be digging in. Time now to govern. Good luck with that.
All right. So that I believe that video was taped. I believe in 2010. So we'll continue the history and dive a little bit deeper into some of the parts that this video talked about. Yeah, just kind of give you a quick background on the Tea Party. I really like, even though this is from Wikipedia, I thought this quote really kind of summarized the multiple different perspectives out there about the Tea Party. So I'm gonna read this. The Tea Party movement has both been cited as an example of grassroots political activity and has also been described as an example of corporate-funded activity made to appear as spontaneous community action, a practice known as astroturfing. Other observers see the organization as having its grassroots elements amplified by the right-wing media and supported by elite funding. So you can see there's multiple perspectives. The people that were in it, they truly believed it was a grassroots movement against Obama, against pushing ultra conservative policies and things in neoliberal policies. And they believe that a lot of them were aware that Fox News was supporting them a lot. We're aware that Koch brothers and at least the organizations that Koch brothers funded, like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works, were pumping out a lot of money and hosting the conventions and paying for events and helping organize. So, but they viewed it as first the grassroots party came, and then all these elite funding, corporate funding, and Fox News and different organizations came afterwards to kind of help amplify it. And then there's other critics that say, well, these organizations have been working on launching a quote Tea Party movement for over a decade before the actual Tea Party movement happened, particularly the Koch brothers with a lot of their they've been involved with AstroTurf organizations since the 90s, fighting anti-tobacco, anti-oil taxations, and talked a lot about this dream of theirs to organize a Tea Party movement. It was anti-government, anti-taxes, and pro-neoliberal capitalism. And when the Tea Party movement did happen, they were very much involved with at least a lot of their organizations like Freedom Works and American for Prosperity were very much involved in organizing events and pumping a lot of money into advertising, and as well as Fox News and other organizations. So, take it for what it is. I'm sure people will have their views, but I think it's important to see there's both sides. But we're going to talk a little bit about what Tea Party actually members actually viewed. But most of this section, full disclosure, we're going to talk about how corporations and Fox News and political right influenced the Tea Party movement, whether so I'm not going to doubt that Tea Party people didn't believe in what they were fighting for. I'm just I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the narratives they were fighting for, how that was influenced by corporations like Koch brothers and Fox News. So, just to give a little bit of background, Tea Party started, particularly when Obama became in office. It was his immediate anti-Obama movement. It was the stimulus package. Obama inherited its recession. A lot of the stimulus programs were actually passed by George Bush, but, Obama got the blame for a lot of them. But he did pass things like, he had, stimulus bills for car industries, manufacturing industries. He was pushing Recession, funds to help out with Black owners. They were particularly hit the hardest because of the reverse redlining, because particularly Wells Fargo and Bank of America, they both got lost court cases around this, targeted Black people specifically for toxic loans, the same toxic loans that eventually blew up the bubble, investment bubble and the housing bubble, and caused the 2008 recession. But there was, the narrative was twisted that because of it, they were forced on. Give you a little background. They were these banks, targeted Black communities and pushed these subprime loans, where these really awful loans that had high interest rates and were a lot harder to pay back. So when the recession did hit, and people were losing their jobs, Black people, disproportionately, significantly lost way more homes, and were evicted from their homes than white people. And to the point that you look at all the gains of Black homeownership from the 60s, from the Fair Housing Act to now, that was completely wiped out, and they were hit really hard. So so Obama, did try to pass some legislation, some funding, to support Black home ownerships, and that was a big a big issue for Tea Partiers. So they were really focused on deficit spending, their anti-stimulus package, spending, increasing the deficit. They're focused on national debt. They're very anti-cap and trade, anti-healthcare reform, anti-immigration reform. But a lot of these, a lot of things that they're attacking were actually false narratives that was created by Fox News, or was created by Koch brothers, such as like the political fact lie of the year was when Obama was trying to pass healthcare reform. There was this lie about Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which was named Obamacare, had death panels, which was basically going to be, panels of doctors who basically chose which patients lived and died. Completely BS. It was completely made up, but this was a huge rallying point for the Tea Party, to the point that they had these huge rallies because out of fear that their parents and sick people were going to, the government was going to start deciding they shouldn't live. So that was and that was a big rally point, and that was completely made up. Another one is a lot of racism, Islamophobia, Red Scare myths around Obama, believing that he was a Muslim, which even if he was, it's not, it shouldn't be a big deal, but in this country, unfortunately, there's a lot of Islamophobia, and so to Tea Partiers, it was a big deal. So he believed he was a Muslim. He believed he wasn't born in the U.S. He was Kenyan. They believed he was, a socialist, a communist. Believed he was fascist. A lot of Red Scare myths, about socialized healthcare reform. Even though the reform he was pushing was a far cry from socialized medicine, it was still enough to scare people to thinking that they were going to have this awful, healthcare system. And so there was a lot around Obama. You can see this. There's a lot of racism around, the signage that you would see at Tea Party rallies, effigies of Black people, dolls being hung, a lot of racist signage, a lot of Islamophobia signage, and there's tons of surveys where the vast majority of Tea Partiers thought he was a Muslim, thought he wasn't born in America. So that was a big rallying point for a lot of people. Misunderstandings about like debt ceiling. They were opposing, debt ceiling, which understandably, we need to get, we need to do something about our deficit spending, or about our deficit and our national debt. But the debt ceiling isn't, that needs to happen during our budget, not during our debt ceiling. Sometimes we have to raise the debt ceiling in order to actually pay off our loans and pay off the things that we decided during our budget hearing. And if we don't raise that, then we actually default on a lot of things. And and I'm not strong in economics, but it's a pretty horrific thing when we can't actually pay off our debts. But they pushed this as a debt ceiling was this was the actual budget, and that they could rally around it. They could stop us from spending the money when the money was already being spent. It was about covering it. So there was a lot of confusion around that. A big belief that black homeowners that were responsible for recessions, that a lot of black people went out and got loans and then were irresponsible with it, and they defaulted, and they created the bubble, not the fact that the banks were unregulated and pushing toxic loans onto black people, but it was black people's fault. And this really kind of reinforces, we're going to have this class on welfare, history of welfare racism, and it really reinforces this idea that black people are undeserving of government assistance. Like when white people love welfare, and until LBJ opened it up to black people. It was great when it was only for white people, because the white people are deserving poor, and then black people are undeserving poor. They're just taking advantage of welfare queens. They're taking advantage, like when you say welfare queens, no one ever pictures a white woman. It's always black women. So it's just Reagan and all these people created all these racial dog whistles around pushing this racism around welfare, black people and welfare. And so a lot of this was a continuation of just black people being belief that they were irresponsible. And then when Obama wanted to help them out, that was again a toxic program. It was just helping people that that were dependent on the government, all this stuff. So there's a lot of racism around that. And then this idea of voter fraud, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but in this section, but it's idea that that really organized, the Koch brothers really pushed a lot of ideas around voter fraud, because voter fraud is this great myth that the Republicans use to push voter suppression, even though voter fraud is basically non-existent. They push this fear that there is voter fraud, and then they have to counter it with voter suppression. So a lot of these narratives were a part of it. So they had real narratives, like, it's for real. We need to control our deficit spending. We need to control national debt. We need healthcare reform, things like that. But unfortunately, that was also mixed with a lot of false narratives. And at the same time, Trump has blown up our deficit, blown up our debt. Caused all kinds of things that people were angry with Obama at, and we don't see any Tea Party rallies as well. So there's a lot of assumptions. Like, again, there's a lot of perspectives. I'm sure it's different from different members, but all of this we have to kind of like look at the bigger picture of what's happening. Yes, there are some real issues, and yes, there were some false narratives, and yes, there was a lot of racism and things like that. So we have to understand all of it kind of together. And if we look at who are the Tea Partiers, vast majority of them were white. Many of them, a huge representation was Christian evangelicals. They had a populist kind of nativist, ultra conservative platform that they were pushing, a neoliberal platform as well. And they had a huge impact, for a while, particularly in the 2010 election. They got 44 House members got elected and 5 Senate. That's huge to have. That's a huge number of senators for this emerging movement. And even in every election since up until 2016, we see even more. 2012, 4 candidates won a seat on the Senate. Huge gains. 2014 gains in like Texas and other places on a state level. Governorship, in Kentucky, 3 senators again. 2016. So and they created this party. This Freedom Caucus party that really pushed the Republicans way farther to the right, to the neoliberal, ultra-conservative right. And we can see this. I think it's a really great quote by Jeremy Peters. Kind of talks about the fact that even though the Tea Party has kind of died, since then, there's still a lot of lasting effects. And he writes, the idea is that animated, the Tea Party movement has been largely abandoned by Republicans under President Trump. $1 trillion deficits are back and on track to keep growing. The Affordable Care Act has never been repealed, and Republicans concede it may never be. When Congress approved $320 billion in new spending this month as part of of this latest budget deal, most Republicans in the Senate voted yes, prompting a lament from Senator Rand Paul. He was one of the Tea Party senators elected in 2010 of Kentucky, who was first elected in 2010 as a slash and burn fiscal conservative. So he says the Tea Party is no more, he said. But Mr. Paul and others who have signed the Tea Party's death certificate overlooked one way it continues to define the country today. It ignited a rival of politics of outrage and mistrust in government, breathing new life into the populist passions that continue to threaten the stability of both political parties. Even if the Tea Party's ideas are dead, its attitudes live on. I think we can really see that with support for Trump right now. So there's been countless studies, particularly around Pew Research Center, that's documented that people that were involved in the Tea Party, or at least supportive of the Tea Party, are much more likely to be supportive of Donald Trump right now. And that's with Donald Trump blowing up the deficit and doing a lot of things that they really oppose Obama doing, as opposed to people that weren't in the Tea Party or didn't support the Tea Party. We see less support for Donald Trump right now. So that really, the Tea Party really kind of defined this more extreme Republican Party that's more farther to the right, and kind of it created a divide between moderate Republicans and more extreme conservative Republicans that we're still seeing today. So Voice of America did this really great clip too. It talks a little bit more in depth about the Tea Party. I'm going to play this before.
In this election year in the United States, a majority of Americans say the country is on the wrong track. And no segment of the electorate is more frustrated with the U.S. government and President Barack Obama than the folks driving the Tea Party movement. George Washington University professor Chris Arterton says the Tea Party movement is actually thousands of local groups spread all over the United States.
They take pride in not having a national leader and not allowing national leadership to take over their movement and direct it.
In small Tea Party meetings in restaurants, or large gatherings of Tea Party delegates dancing the night away before the next day's Tea Party convention, to massive Tea Party rallies in cities across the country, certain core beliefs emerge.
Large government, too many taxes.
The Constitution was being trampled on.
The country's basically going deeper into debt.
We need to restore a sense of faith.
Bring the country back to its founding principles.
For Tea Party members, the prime example of big government and legislative excess is the Obama health care plan, now law, or as Tea Party followers call it, Obamacare. Obamacare has a mandate. All Americans will eventually have to get health insurance. This mandate, say Tea Partiers, is, well, un-American.
It's when you mandate something that you have no business mandating.
It's socialism.
Because you enjoy citizenship, have to buy something.
It's simply unconstitutional.
Socialism is not freedom.
I don't think it is socialized medicine. It's a far cry from that, but of course it is more government involvement.
When Obama took office, most Americans were really more concerned about their jobs and their mortgages in the midst of a global recession. The U.S. unemployment rate was hovering close to 10%. Obama's decisions in response to this economic misery, says Chris Arterton, planted the seeds of discontent among many Americans, including most Tea Party members.
Bailing out Wall Street and the banks and the automobile companies. And a lot of people are saying this isn't helping me. I'm the one who's unemployed. I'm the one who's about to lose my house.
But it was George W. Bush's administration that initiated many of the economic rescue policies continued by President Obama. But Bush is a Christian conservative, and so are many Tea Party supporters, and many of them are suspicious of Obama.
He was born Muslim. He was raised Muslim. He was born in Kenya.
I've never seen any evidence of his Christianity.
I think there's a great possibility that he's a Muslim.
If you have a Muslim father, then the offspring are Muslims.
Barack Obama was really raised by his mother and by his grandmother rather than by his father.
But there are many Americans, including many in the Tea Party, who think Obama was not even born in the United States. Surveys show a majority of Tea Party members get their news and information from the Fox News television network.
Fox News personality Glenn Beck is a Tea Party favorite. At a rally in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, Beck played to the huge crowd with talk that some say sounded like a sermon.
See what the Lord is putting in front of you now.
I think he does a lot of good in the country.
He's trying to restore the faith aspect.
Church and state were supposed to be together. They were founded on prayer.
For too long, this country has wandered in darkness.
I think Glenn Beck's an amazing American.
I love Glenn Beck, the phenomenal research that he provides.
He's a man who's got a lot of truth.
I'm a fan.
Also fans several prominent conservative Republicans who were quite eager to prove they share the same values and concerns that animate the Tea Party when they showed up at the Virginia Tea Party convention in Richmond a couple of weeks ago.
The government we have in Washington, D.C. is too big to succeed in America. It's not about collecting a government check, but it's about earning. A representative democracy is the best idea of mankind.
Chris Arterton says Tea Party conservatives worry that Americans are becoming more secular and losing a strong sense of patriotism. And for this, Arterton says, they mostly blame President Obama.
Barack Obama symbolizes the changes that are happening in this country as we do, in fact, become more diverse.
So is the Tea Party movement here to stay? Who knows? But for now, they're fired up and ready to go. Why? Now you know. I'm Todd Groshans.
All right, and that video pointed out another false narrative that a lot of Tea Partiers, including religious right, believe that we're a nation that's founded on Christianity, when in fact we are a secular nation founded on separation of church and state. But that's we talk a lot about that during the religious rights section as well. So now I want to talk a little bit about Astroturfs. And so I'm going to play this quick video, just a quick little clip of this video to define Astroturfs, and we're going to dive a little bit into the beginning of Astroturfs in the 90s in this country.
So, consider this fictitious example that's inspired by real life. Say you're watching the news and you see a story about a new study on the cholesterol-lowering drug called Cholextra. The study says Cholextra is so effective that doctors should consider prescribing it to adults and even children who don't yet have high cholesterol. Is it too good to be true? You're smart, you decide to do some of your own research. You do a Google search, you consult social media, Facebook and Twitter, you look at Wikipedia, WebMD, a nonprofit website, and you read the original study in a peer-reviewed published medical journal. It all confirms how effective Cholextra is. You do run across a few negative comments and a potential link to cancer, but you dismiss that because medical experts call the cancer link a myth and say that those who think there is a link there are quacks and cranks and nuts. Finally, you learn that your own doctor recently attended a medical seminar. The lecture that he attended confirmed how effective Cholextra is, so he sends you off with some pre-samples and a prescription. You've really done your homework. But what if all isn't as it seems? What if the reality you found was false? A carefully constructed narrative by unseen special interests designed to manipulate your opinion. A Truman Show-esque alternate reality all around you. Complacency in the news media combined with incredibly powerful propaganda and publicity forces mean we sometimes get little of the truth. Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role. Surreptitious astroturf methods are now more important to these interests than traditional lobbying of Congress. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington. What is astroturf? It's a perversion of grassroots, as in fake grassroots. Astroturf is when political, corporate, or other special interests disguise themselves and publish blogs, start Facebook and Twitter accounts, publish ads, letters to the editor, or simply post comments online to try to fool you into thinking an independent or grassroots movement is speaking. The whole point of Astroturf is to try to give the impression there's widespread support for or against an agenda when there's not.
All right. And then she continues to talk about different kinds of examples and stuff. If you want to, it's a great video. It's like, I think 15 minutes long if you want to watch it. But I just really wanted to just kind of pull out and use their great definition about what are astroturfs, and how easy it is to feel like when you're in an astroturf campaign, to feel that you're the one that's coming up with these decisions and these facts, and that you feel like you cross-checked all this stuff and it's all working out, when in fact, it's about creating, this propaganda on multiple levels to make you feel like you came to that conclusion yourself. And it's a very, very powerful tool that's been really perfected since the 90s, in this country. So talking about early astroturfs, so one George Manabiat, he's a great writer. He writes a lot for The Guardian, has a really great article about the founding of the Tea Party, and astroturfs. So he writes, to add a little bit more to the definition of astroturfs. An astroturf campaign is a fake grassroots movement. It purports to be a spontaneous uprising of concerned citizens, but in reality is founded and funded by elite interests. Some astroturf campaigns have no grassroots component at all. Others catalyze and direct real mobilizations. The Tea Party belongs in the second category. It is mostly composed of passionate, well-meaning people who think they are fighting elite power, unaware that they are being organized by the very interests they believe in, they are confronting. We now have powerful evidence that the movement was established and has been guided with the help of money from billionaires and big business. Much of this money, as well as much of the strategy and staffing, were provided by two brothers who run what they call the biggest company you never heard of. So I really want to pull this one line out where it says, it says, is mostly composed of passionate, well-meaning people who think they are fighting elite power, unaware that they're actually being organized by that same power. So that's an important thing to understand, because we're not saying that everyone in the Tea Party was super big fans of Koch brothers. I mean, most of them probably were not big fans of Koch brothers, or never even heard of them. But it didn't stop the fact that Koch brothers was pumping in an enormous amount of money, organizing Tea Party rallies, training Tea Party leaders, disseminating, creating, false narratives, as rallying points for Tea Party. So we have to understand that, how that all plays out. So let's talk a little bit about the Koch brothers. So the Koch brothers, they're basically, they own, they have Koch Industries. It's the second largest privately owned company in the United States. It's a one of the richest corporations. It has tons of different things, from oil refineries to coal suppliers to chemical plants to logging firms, and they often pull in around 100 billion a year in revenue. At the same time, they are one of the leading polluters, and one of the leading greenhouse gas creators in this country. There's been multiple studies that ranked, corporations on the levels of polluting, and they're always in like the top 20 corporations in the world that's destroying this planet. At the same time, they since the 90s, they've been very politically active, where they have pumped billions and billions into our into elections and policy making and think tanks, and to basically push anti-tax policies, anti-regulations, anti-climate change, libertarian, and neoliberal free market policies. So essentially, they're pushing policy that's going to essentially make them a lot more money. And so they founded really important organizations as well. I mean, they're really integral with this rise movement in the 80s of the neoliberal policies, and they founded think tanks. Some of the first neoliberal think tanks, like Cato Institute, Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and these are organizations that essentially write policies and advocate governments to push more neoliberal policies like anti-tax and anti-environmental regulations. These organizations and the Koch brothers were huge on convincing a large portion of our population that climate change is not is fake, or it's not something to worry about. So they've really the impacts that they've had in this country over the last couple of decades have been pretty horrific. And it's I don't think I'm exaggerating when I'm saying they're one of the main people that are essentially destroying our planet and trying to stop any kind of government intervention and involvement to prevent that from happening. So I really like, George Monbiot, writes, the Kochs want to pay less tax, keep more profits, and be restrained by less regulation. Their challenge has been to persuade the people harmed by this agenda that it's good for them. So that, so the big goal of a lot of their efforts is to convince people that are actually harmed by deregulations of their markets, by government policies that allow Koch brothers to poison the planet, poison our water systems, poison the air that we breathe, not pay their fair share of taxes, prevent policies that can prevent climate change disasters, these policies hurt everyone in our country, from rise we see in cancer rates and all the health effects that we're having from the environmental injustices that we're having from the water, pollution in the water and the air, and so this is something that hurts everyone in this country, but they're able to push their agenda because they're able to convince enough people that are being hurt by this, that these policies are actually good for them. And that's through a lot of these neoliberal, libertarian, individual liberties, ideas. So, in the 1990s, they actually teamed up with Big Tobacco, which is like Philip Morris and a couple other, leading tobacco industries. And they created, essentially what we consider, some of the first astroturf movements and astroturf organizations in America or in the United States, particularly to fight tobacco and oil taxes and regulations. So I think that at this time, particularly in the 90s, we started realizing just how horrific, tobacco was, and how devastating oil industries was to the environment. And so, a lot of states are trying to propose new taxes and regulations to kind of pay for, and help out a lot of the damage that they've done. So in the response, Koch brothers and Big Tobacco, they organized a lot of different organizations. One of the biggest ones like Citizens for a Sound Economy, but they also organized Get Government Off Our Back, Enough is Enough, Citizens Against Regressive Taxation, all these different organizations. They founded them, funded them, but then also, kept their names off of them. So they made them seem like they're these like grassroots movements of just concerned citizens that were worried about, big government, trying to stifle, innovation and capitalism and individual liberties and things like that. So, kind of a lot of things that you hear now still to this day that the Republican parties often use, their false narratives. So and they were very successful in a lot of states. They were able to stop new taxes, new regulations, able to push a lot of anti-government sentiment and policies, so they were pretty successful. And not only that, they kind of mastered this art of astroturfs, and also helped create the foundations of numerous different organizations that were really integral in continuing astroturfs even to this day. So I'm going to read this another quote by George Monbiot. He writes, the Kochs have lavished money on more than 30 other advocacy groups, including the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, the George C. Marshall Institute, the Reason Foundation, and the American Enterprise Institute. These bodies have been instrumental in turning politicians away from environmental laws, social spending, taxing the rich, and distributing wealth. They have shaped a widespread demand for small government. The Kochs ensure that their money works for them. If we're all going to give a lot of money, David Koch explained to a libertarian journalist, we'll make darn sure they spend it in the way that goes along with our intent. And if they make a wrong turn and start doing things we don't agree with, we withdraw funding. Most of these bodies call themselves free market think tanks, but their trick, as Astroturf Wars points out, Astroturf Wars is a documentary we're going to talk about in a second, is to conflate crony capitalism with free enterprise, and free enterprise with personal liberty. Between them, they have constructed a philosophy that informs the Tea Party movement. And its members mobilize for freedom, unaware that freedom they demand is freedom for corporations to trample them into the dirt. The think tanks that the Kochs have funded devise the game and the rules by which it's played. Americans for Prosperity coaches and motivates the team. All right. So the next slide we're going to talk about is Koch brothers' Tea Party movement. And depending on your opinion, this isn't. We're not. At least at first, we're not going to talk about the actual Tea Party movement that rose in 2009. This is something that that the Koch brothers have been talking about and been planning for since the early 2000s. Was this idea of creating this anti-tax, individual liberty, neoliberal, a movement that they call the U.S. Tea Party, and you can actually see. I mean, there's actually multiple of their organizations, their AstroTurf organizations, like they actually talked about this idea. This is a 2002. I mean, again, remember this is like early 2000s internet, so even though this looks pretty janky, this is if you can remember back then, this was how most websites looked. So this was actually, one of the many pages that they produced, in 2002. This was actually from the Citizens from a Sound Economy. This was one of their main AstroTurfs in the 90s that worked against, anti, tobacco and oil taxes and regulations. And that Citizens for a Sound Economy later broke apart and became two organizations, Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity, both funded and organized by the Koch brothers to push their neoliberal agenda. But this website, it talks about this is early 2000. It talks about this idea of building this nationwide Tea Party movement that would be backed by neoliberal think tanks and policies, and they would focus on getting also conservative politicians elected and libertarians elected, and then they would have news outlets pushing their agenda and all this stuff. So they envisioned the Tea Party movement at least a decade before it actually was established. And George Monbiot writes, the Tea Party movement is remarkable in two respects. It is one of the biggest exercises in false consciousnesses the world has seen, and the biggest AstroTurf operation in history. These accomplishments are closely related. So starting in early 2000s, Tea Party, they start funding, or Koch brothers start funding numerous organizations to kind of, build out this Tea Party movement. They have the Americans for Prosperity, which is probably the main one that they start funding. These people are the people that fund, like, if you remember the buses that would go around, the anti-Obamacare buses and all these, cap and trades, anti-cap and trade platforms. A lot of that was coordinated through the Americans for Prosperity. And Freedom Works, and then Sam Adams Alliance, which I think it was that O'Keefe guy. It wasn't Koch brothers. Well, supposedly they didn't found them. It's actually founded on this anonymous large donation, and we don't know who actually did that donation. But in theory, they didn't found the Sam Adams Alliance. But they did work with them and fund them and push a lot of funding towards them. And then the idea was they were going to organize this Tea Party, where they would have rallies and have talking points that were, that eventually evolved, as soon as Obama, became president, evolved around a lot of, anti-Obama, not only anti-Obama himself, but also a lot of his issues around cap and trade, which was like climate change legislation, healthcare reform, things like that. So they had this whole infrastructure ready to go. So when actually like Rick Santelli, CNBC, reporter was on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, talking about how awful it is that Obama's trying to help black homeowners who lost their homes, and how pushing this myth that it was their own fault for losing these loans, not the fact that they were pushed these toxic because they were denied legitimate loans and pushed all these toxic loans on that caused the recession. But I mean, so but he was pushing this idea that the whole recession was the fault of black homeowners, and how awful it was that our taxes would go to help undeserving black people. Again, this this welfare racism narrative that was been forming since literally the 50s and 60s, particularly when LBJ opened up a lot of our welfare programs to black people. So he was pushing this, and he called for a Tea Party, a revolt, a bankers revolt, where they would throw whatever into the river. And so that same day, literally the same day that aired, Americans for Prosperity set up a Tea Party Facebook page and started organizing, immediately started organizing Tea Party rallies all over the country. And then I want to read this from Jeff Nesman that he actually wrote a book about the secret origins of the Tea Party movement. And he wrote, according to this publicly available IRS records, the 5 essential pillars of just such a Tea Party movement network were all funded and in place by the spring of 2009. The Sam Adams Alliance to direct grassroots efforts, the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity to direct propaganda efforts in state capitals across the United States, the State Policy Network to coordinate funding and free market policies at state-based think tanks, hundreds of grants from Koch foundations to American universities that were linked in through SPN, of course, CSE successor. SPM, I'm sorry, sorry, I don't remember exactly who that was, but and then he talks about Americans for Prosperity. So CSE or SE, was Citizens for CSE, sorry, was Citizens for a Sound Economy. That they talked about the successor, Americans for Prosperity, built to coordinate the effort nationally. So they're like the key organization that was coordinating all these efforts, these think tanks and these Koch Foundation grants, these policy writing organizations. So they are coordinating all of this into a national movement. All of them saw their budgets expand significantly as Obama ran for the White House and took office months or even a full year before the Tea Party movement erupted into public view. This explains why the Tea Party movement was able to mobilize, spread, and network so rapidly as if by magic. And that's, again, it's not to say that Tea Party people didn't believe that what they were fighting for was this grassroots movement. And there wasn't, even though there was a lot of false narratives, there was a lot of racism. But out of some of it, there was some legitimate issues, and it's not to say any of that, but this, behind the scenes, we see this whole foundation that's coordinating these false narratives, coordinating these rallies, paying for huge rallies, paying for advertisements, paying for busing, all this stuff that's happening. The Tea Party would not have been as big if it wasn't for this foundation that the Koch brothers created. And there's actually a really fantastic documentary called Astroturf Wars. I don't know who exactly broke a lot of this, but they did some really amazing research. He went undercover to a lot of Tea Party rallies and Tea Party conventions and things, and taped a lot of amazing footage, particularly of like Koch brothers and how taking credit for a lot of this stuff. I'm just going to play you the trailer, but I definitely recommend. I definitely recommend that you check out this the full documentary. Especially if you want to understand just how this whole infrastructure was created and how it organized the Tea Party movement.
He is a communist. He is a racist. He is worse than Hitler. He says he wants to destroy the world. We're against socialism in America.
You know, always leads to communism. It's a Marxist regime, basically. The Obama administration, the Democratic Party is going totally to the left, so extreme now.
America is in the grip of a mass citizen revolt against the agenda of President Barack Obama and the Democrats. But just how real are the roots of this supposedly grassroots uprising?
This initiative is funded by the high end. We call it AstroTurf.
The astroturfing of healthcare reform.
AstroTurf. It's AstroTurf, etc., etc.
Astroturfing is something we use to describe fake grassroots organizations. These citizens groups are bogus, and what we're really seeing is the fine hand of the corporate propagandist at work.
Determined to find out if these charges were true, I went undercover, finding mysteriously well-funded groups, convincing citizens to oppose healthcare reform.
Hands off our healthcare.
Americans for Prosperity as a grassroots organization.
Meeting supposedly independent experts.
I am not getting a penny for what I'm doing.
Who turned out to be fronting for the oil industry.
What now?
And revealing how that ultimate citizen uprising, the Tea Parties.
It's a movement that is sweeping the nation all across the country.
It may involve millions of people.
Mr. President, here we are!
being secretly guided to suit the agendas of America's corporate elites.
We are drowning in propaganda, drowning in it. It's making real democracy all but impossible.
People are very much unaware of the front groups, unaware of how their thoughts are being manipulated and how their actions are actually being manipulated in many cases.
We are here at our own expense, in our own interest.
This is essentially deception on a massive scale.
This is not some corporately sponsored thing.
Yet, these people have a perfect right to do it and hide their involvement in it. There seems to me to be something wrong with that.
All right. So definitely, I recommend checking out this documentary. It's really well done, and it really dives into, deeply to like the nuts and bolts of the AstroTurf part of the Tea Party. I want to play this other part from the Young Turks. They played a part of the Astroturfs, and this is one of the main parts, because the Koch brothers, I mean, they were up front, with a lot of these lies right at the beginning, saying they weren't financing any of these organizations. They never even heard of, a lot of these organizations. They weren't involved. They weren't coordinating. And thanks to this documentary, they actually got tape of the Koch brothers is admitting that yes, they were behind all this. They funded everything. So I'm just going to play this a little bit, and this is from the Young Turks, and he's going to give a little bit of a commentary as well.
Americans for Prosperity is a group that has organized a lot of events and buses and protests, etc., for the Tea Parties, as you're about to see. And the Koch brothers started Americans for Prosperity, and they funded it. And Koch brothers are among the richest people in the country. They have the largest privately, I believe it's the second largest privately held corporation in the United States of America. They're billionaires, and they like to keep their money. So they fund these groups to make sure that the top 1% continue to have tax cuts. They fund these groups to make sure that their oil companies don't get regulated, and that people think that global warming is a myth, so that they can continue to pollute, as their companies have been cited over and over for pollution, right? So they have a deep financial incentive to make sure that there is deregulation, that cap and trade is killed, and that they have lower taxes for themselves. But when asked about this, the Koch brothers came out on the record and said, oh, no, Americans for Prosperity. What name so? No, we have nothing to do with any Tea Parties or anything associated with a Tea Party. Well, funny enough, it turns out there's video of David Koch at American for Prosperity event, and you'll get to see for yourself whether that's true or not true. Clip number 7.
Five years ago, my brother Charles and I provided the funds to start the Americans for Prosperity. And it's beyond my wildest dreams how AFP has grown into this enormous organization of hundreds of thousands of American citizens from all walks of life, standing up and fighting for the economic freedoms that have made our nation the most prosperous society in history.
Oops. Let's find out. Did they fund any tea parties?
We helped organize huge tea parties all throughout the state. And on April 15th, tax day, over 10,000 Californians joined us on the steps of the state capitol, and we held one of the largest tea parties in the country.
We have flagged the largest tea party in the state.
The largest tax day tea party in the nation on April 15th.
Hey folks, we've held 29 tea parties, organized dozens of tea parties.
This is a phenomenal success in my judgment. 800,000 activists from nothing 5 years ago. This is a remarkable achievement. And we're being effective in so many different ways.
We had over 9,000 Colorado activists attend the Patients First bus tour.
All across our state, our members have said
Hands off our health care.
Keep your hands off my health care. Keep their hands off our health care. Hands off our health care.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are sending a clear message to our representatives to vote no on the cap and trade tax scheme.
That legislation that you all heard about that will cap America's prosperity and trade our jobs.
Mr. Chairman, our grassroots efforts are engaged, they're energized, and they're ready to fight for their freedoms.
The media portrays us as being backed by some billionaire person or people or group, and it's not. We're individual citizens who are just wanting to make it.
It's nonsense. There is no such thing among our people as astroturfing.
We are here at our own expense, in our own interest.
So I thank all of you for coming here today from so many different parts of the country to make this statement that the American dream of free enterprise, capitalism is alive and well.
Now that comes from Astroturf Wars, a movie that we discussed on the show before. You can find my interview on that on TYT Interviews. You know, I also had an interview here with a New York Times writer who wrote a book about the Tea Parties, and we had a little debate as to whether their buses in particular were funded by Americans for Prosperity, and she said people take their own buses. Really? Who paid for the giant hands off my healthcare sign that wrapped the bus up? Those are independent buses? No. Americans for Prosperity paid for the bus, wrapped the bus, and put those same talking points that you then later heard from all those people, put it in their mouths. Oh, they take your hands off my healthcare. Gee, I wonder where they got that idea. One of my favorite parts was like those guys at the end saying, nonsense, the idea that some billionaires are financing us. A billionaire just spoke to you and said, I financed the whole thing. He's a billionaire. He just told you he was doing it. Nonsense, no such thing, no. And look, so one guy said we came at our own expense. Do some people come to at their own expense to some events? Of course. But that's even worse than they're using their own money to help that billionaire avoid taxes and regulation so he can continue to pollute and keep more of his money. And if they think that's in their best interest, boy, are they wildly misled. See, this is how it works, and this is why that clip is so important. These guys do it for their own interest. You think that David Koch, giving that speech there, set up that organization and paid for all that stuff because he wanted to help those schleps down there? He wanted to make sure that they didn't have choices in healthcare insurance and that somehow helps them? He wanted to make sure that they didn't have cap and trade because those guys, were worried about what the carbon output for them? No, he's worried about the carbon output from his oil companies and his refineries. And that would cost him more money. And he would have to pay for the pollution that he causes that sometimes makes us sick. And, that is a cost to all of us in terms of that going into our environment and all the costs associated with that. Because David Koch doesn't want to pay that cost. He just wants to pocket it and make an extra couple of $1 billion. Come on. Wake up.
All right, and Young Turks. I mean, they're obviously they're very anti-neoliberal organization and very opinionated about that. So I wasn't playing that as to push his braceness on. But I think at the same time he makes. I mean, it just. He wraps it so perfectly, Koch brothers are not pumping billions of dollars into these, foundations, these organizations, and this mass movements to help everyone. They're doing it so they can, they didn't spend all this money to eliminate cap and trade, for the average person. That was purely for their oil refineries, and yet they got mobilized tens of thousands of people to march on capitals, demanding that cap and trade was a violation of our individual liberties and things like that. So it's yeah, we have to understand, like the intentions behind, why are they pouring all this money into these organizations. So I want to talk Ian Haney Lopez. We talk a lot about him throughout this course, throughout this section, particularly. He wrote the dog whistle politics. He has this really great article that kind of talks about, summarizes his views. That he summarizes 4 driving factors of the Tea Party, he's coming from a point of, he wrote a whole book about racial dog whistles, which are basically, pushing racist policies while coding it in a way that voters don't feel racist. Talking about, well, it's just about states' rights. It's about individual liberties. It's about, law and order. When those are racial dog whistles, are often pushed policies that specifically hurt, Black communities. So he's looking at through more of a racial perspective. So I want to kind of just read this just to understand, how this fits in as well. So he writes, Tea Party, a fast-spinning tornado of grassroots organizations, billionaire funders, and the partisan right-wing media juggernaut Fox News. The Tea Party movement reflected the confluence of 4 forces. First, the anger and fear of everyday white folks. A few of them, Goldwater Knights, supporters of Barry Goldwater, one of the founders of the modern Republican Party and racial dog whistles. Goldwater Knight holdovers or principled libertarians, but not Reagan Democrats. Person whose political conservatism was directly molded by racially infected fears of a liberal government run by a Black president. Second, opportunist Republicans seeking a new label for a damaged brand. So this is after, remember, this is after Bush, essentially, destroys our economy, or allows our economy to be destroyed, depending on your perspective. It causes this massive recession, and then so Republican Party was an all-time low, when it came for voters, and that's why, Obama, among one of the main reasons why Obama won so big in 2008, he won a supermajority, so that had a lot to do with this, the low opinion of Republicans at the time. So Republicans were looking for a new way to kind of, rebrand themselves. Third, right-wing billionaires like the Koch brothers, with their well-funded propaganda machines, who saw in the fear and anger directed at Obama a new opportunity to case their agenda in populist terms. So this is particularly because we see a lot of racism towards Obama at these rallies, a lot of racism in the signs, a lot of racism that's mixed also into opposing Obama's policies, like cap and trade, like healthcare. He was often called this Muslim, socialist, communist, fascist, person for trying to reform our healthcare system, a system that desperately needed to be reformed, but because it was and still is a system that a lot, that makes a lot of profits for a small group of people at the cost of our health. So you see all this, like this racism and this fear and anger from Obama mixed into these neoliberal talking points, and that's what's the beauty of or what Koch brothers have perfected over decades, is how to create these propaganda machines that makes people really feel like they came to these conclusions themselves. And then fourth, Fox News and the right-wing media machine more generally promoted the movement and helped racially agitate and misinform its soldiers. So Fox News was a critical piece that was pushing a lot of false narratives, from death panels to, it was Black homeowners are responsible for recession, to, we live in a Christian nation, Glenn Beck, really pushed that, that we were founded as a Christian nation. To summarize all this, and he writes, reviewing all of this, we can now answer a basic question. Was the Tea Party driven by conservatism or by race? The answer is empathetically yes. Inextricably combining conservatism and racism, the Tea Party was almost wholly a creature of right-wing dog whistle politics. The contradictions others have noted in the Tea Party, so difficult to resolve without reference to race, becomes intelligible when looked at through the lens of dog whistle politics. Tea Partiers could oppose big government, yet insist that social Social Security and Medicare were sacrosanct, because they continued to see welfare as something liberals doled out to lazy non-whites. They weren't hostile to the New Deal programs on which they relied on. On the contrary, like generations before, they supported core New Deal values and many safety net programs. What they resented was the sense that their taxes were being wasted on undeserving minorities. So not to say that, every person that was a Tea Partier, when it isn't, we have to understand racial dog whistles. This isn't saying that everyone is an openly racist person that hates black people. This is saying that most of these Tea Party people really bought into the coded racism, the racial dog whistles that the Republican Party started, in the 50s and 60s, and continue even to this day, pushing these ideas that our government is too big and wastes all our money on undeserving minorities, and all these different things that trying to protect the environment is hurting our, is attack on our individual liberties, trying to finance, trying to provide healthcare for everyone is actually socialism or communism or fascism. So all these different things were kind of mixed into this stuff, and that was a big driving force of the Tea Party. And then at the same time, we have to understand too that the Republicans' roles in creating this extreme, Republican, party, and create this divide in the Republican Party. And a lot of this came from basically the Republican leadership, who weren't all extreme. I mean, a lot of these were moderates. Their main strategy when Obama got elected, and that was when Obama got elected. Majority of the Republican leadership, immediately had meetings. Eric Cantor, Mitch McConnell, Mike Pence, and they came up with this plan essentially that their main priority would be to gain back the majority in Congress and limit Obama to a one-term president. So that meant blocking every single bill that they could, that the Democrats were trying to push through. And that was essential too, because Democrats had a super majority up until Ted Kennedy died, and then Scott Brown won, a Republican Tea Party won his seat, and then they lost that supermajority, and then that's when we see them they just filibuster in the Senate every bill that they can, and they're demonizing Democrats too, talking about how Democrats are doing a horrible job fixing the economy, while at the same time opposing every single piece of legislation meant to jobs bills and stimulus bills to kind of actually fix the economy. So the goal was to create a lot of chaos and then blame the Democrats for it. And they knew if they worked with the Democrats, and they openly, Mitch McConnell and a lot of these people openly talk about this. They knew if they worked with the Democrats to fix the economy, to fix healthcare, that ultimately the Democrats and Obama would get most of the credit. And so they knew that they had instead they worked to sabotage as much as possible and then blame Obama. And we know this because they're open about this. This wasn't some secret mission. Mitch McConnell repeatedly on live news networks talked about, and this is his biggest mission was to ensure that Obama serves only one term. He was instrumental in blocking an enormous amount of since 2008, during that time period, his Senate filibustered over 500 pieces of legislation. Just to give you, they blocked 79 presidential nominees and appointments. Only 68 nominees were ever blocked before Obama. So they set new levels, a new precedent of blocking things. Trump always talks about how Obama left him his amazing gift of like 100 federal judge vacancies. He's like, why would he do that? Well, he didn't do that. He tried to fill them, and Mitch McConnell blocked every single attempt and just left them open for sometimes some of them for years, including a Supreme Court seat, so they can fill them when Trump got elected. So at this point, they just threw away our democracy, threw away our Constitution, and just and then we saw they just did whatever they could at this point to stop any kind of legislation from happening, cause all kinds of chaos and block any kind of appointments or nominees or court judges. So I'm gonna read this. Michael Grenwick talks. he says, the Republicans have a real philosophical differences with Obama about the size and scope of government, and many view their resistance as a principled return to the GOP's limited government roots after a spending spree under Bush. But they also filibustered and voted in lockstep against previously uncontroversial Obama priorities, like extended unemployment benefits, expanded infrastructure spending, and small business tax cuts. Senate Republicans even turned routine judicial nominations into legislation ordeals, filibustering 20 of its district court judges, 17 more than had been filibustered under all of his predecessors. Republican leaders simply did not want their fingerprints on the Obama agenda. As McConnell explained, if Americans thought DC politicians were working together, they would credit the president. If they thought DC seemed as ugly and messy as always, they would blame the president. And that's exactly what happened. You know, it's important to understand. Yes, I mean, like, you know, there was some views that you know, the size of the government and spending and things like that, deficit. You know, so there was like some, you know, so there was, you know, you can argue that some of this, the things that they opposed were actually about, you know, legitimate things, according to their party platform. But then there was an enormous amount of things, you know, like small business tax cuts, you know, infrastructure spending, you know, unemployment benefits during a recession. These are things that Republicans normally would support, but didn't, on the pure premise of hurting Obama and the Democrats. And so what this created, not only it created an enormous amount of chaos, it created this, you know, perception that, that Congress was a swamp that couldn't get anything done. And it was, you know, and that's where really where the Tea Party all of a sudden, you know, starts rising. And then we starts winning elections, you know, under this president, under this perception that, you know, all government is terrible, you know, all, you know, we have to get in new blood, you know, people that aren't corrupted by, you know, insiders in government, you know, that and that's where we start seeing a lot of these really extreme, you know, liberal, right-wing, you know, politicians starting, you know, people get elected to Senate seats and House seats. So it was in this atmosphere of division that the Tea Party really rose. And even after the Tea Party, you know, lost, you know, a lot of its significance, that still the narratives still pushed away. You know, Trump, you know, during the primaries in 2016 primaries, you know, there was like 20 Republican candidates, but Trump was really the only one that had no political experience, and that, you know, is really what pushed them forward, because they still, because of that this idea that all government was bad. You know, drain the swamp. Drain the swamp was actually, you know, we talked about this in the earlier section, was actually something that you know, Cambridge Analytica, for some contractor that the Republican Party, you know, Trump hired that stole all of our data from Facebook, and then, you know, and created these very personalized messages to try to persuade us, you know, either to vote or not to vote. They actually came up with this idea of drain the swamp based on a lot of our expressions and feelings about, you know, government during this time period, and how the government was just useless, and both parties were terrible and they couldn't do anything. And that's where, you know, that slogan, drain the swamp, you know, and Trump even gives a speech where he talks, he's like, I hated this slogan at first, but then I used it and people were so, you know, excited about it. That's these narratives that continued even after the Tea Party, you know, kind of went away. These narratives still stay with us, and we're still dealing with these narratives. So Michael Grenwick writes, Republican elites who express frequent outrage about deficit spending and crony capitalism under Obama have been notably muted on these topics in the Trump transition. And then after 8 years of defining itself as the anti-Obama party, 8 years of anti-Obama messaging and organizing, it makes sense that the GOP would be led by ultimate anti-Obama. All 17 Republican candidates for the nomination followed the party line that Obama was turning America into a dystopian hellscape, and all 17 essentially promised to roll back the Obama presidency. So it isn't surprising that plurality in the primary backed the loudest and angriest voice in the anti-Obama brigade, the candidate who questioned not just his policies, but his citizenship. And then we played this, it's another video. I want to say this video maybe came out in 2000, right before the 2016 election, and talking about this, just this divide that's happening in the GOP because of the Tea Party.
Since Donald Trump announced his presidential candidacy in June of 2015, his unprecedented rise has shocked most of the political world. Despite members of the Republican establishment predicting the collapse of his campaign, he has so far pulled ahead of any other candidate. This support points to a split within the Republican Party and a lack of cohesion. So why is the Republican Party so fractured? Well, today there's a clear divide between both ideology and representation within the Republican Party. On one side are established moderate career politicians. Their primary focus over the past few decades has been on limited government, a strong national defense, and the traditional family. However, in recent years, a huge portion of the Republican base has complained that they do not feel accurately represented by who they call Washington insiders. This base is more predominantly focused on social issues like gay marriage and abortion, as well as religious rights. During the election and presidency of George W. Bush, these two bases were still able to work together. Bush ideologically appealed to far-right voters, while passing policy decisions influenced by political insiders like Dick Cheney. But that changed in 2008. The Republican nominee, John McCain, was a decidedly moderate Republican. Some say that his inability to address the far right contributed to President Barack Obama's victory. Following the election, a faction of the Republican Party broke away, and with the financial support of the Koch brothers, formed the Tea Party. Unlike the moderates, the Tea Party appeals to its members on a populist and nativist platform. The divide between moderate conservatives and far-right Tea Partiers is clear in polling. While candidates like Jeb Bush have called for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, there is a larger proportion of Republicans who want them deported. This divide has led to chaos in Congress. In 2013, the government shut down after far-right members of Congress refused to pass a substantial funding bill as it did not defund Obamacare. There are even divisions on key Republican issues like taxation, with considerably higher rates of Tea Partiers opposing taxes on the wealthy. And the situation has gotten even more complicated. In 2015, over 30 Republican members in the House branched off to create the Freedom Caucus. The group allegedly forced the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, to resign. And after an extended appointment period, the new Speaker, Paul Ryan, only agreed to fill the role with the cooperation of the Freedom Caucus. The success of Washington outsiders like Trump, and to a lesser extent Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina, makes sense. It points to a new direction for the Republican Party, away from establishment politicians. With calls for the Tea Party to officially break away from the GOP, the future for fractured Republicans seems uncertain. What's clear is that the two sides no longer see eye to eye. But there are issues that both moderate and far-right Republicans can agree on. Check out this video at the top to find out what Republicans believe. And if you want to learn more about the candidates in the race for the White House, we've put together a playlist for you at the bottom. Thanks for watching Test Tube News.
Okay. Unless you're doing research on the 2016 election, I wouldn't recommend checking out these videos. Unless, yeah, I mean, there are good insights on what happened though, for sure. But okay, so we see that, big takeaway of this is we're seeing the lasting effects. Even as the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party are dying, the division in the Republican Party from the moderate to the extreme is still lasting and still in many ways growing as well. And so a big part we want to talk about too as well, because this is something that we're going to be seeing a lot in our coming election, is poll watching, and particularly so poll watching is something the Republican Party would do. There's official poll watchers that have to go through a training and they're watched, and it's a poll part of program with accountability and things like that, and they watch to make sure everything's done with integrity. And then there's partisan poll watching, which is basically recruiting your voters without any authority to go down and be another observer. And in theory, this could be helpful, except for the way the Republican does this is they target Black communities and they send in a lot of times like off-duty cops and very and very intimidating people to go down there with guns and things and with a goal of purely to kind of intimidate Black voters from actually even showing up and voting. They actually got busted in this in 1982, and they went to, I think it was Philadelphia, and yeah, they just like hired all these like off-duty cops and told them to bring their guns, and they had these like Nazi-like badges, and they went down and just intimidated Black communities and Black voters and try to prevent as many to vote as possible. And the Democrats actually sued, and the federal judge, federal judge actually issued a consent consent decree, which basically banned them from doing this. But for some reason, the federal judge in 2018 decided to lift that consent decree, even though they Republicans have never stopped voting suppression and for one bit. For some reason, these judges feel like it's they learned their lesson and they're not gonna, which they're already immediately, they're pouring millions of dollars and they're already, to hire poll watchers to go into black communities and scare people. They're even, Trump's sons are talking about, encouraging people, to form militias and bring weapons and things down the poll. I mean, it's going to be really scary. There's actually articles now being written what to do if there's an armed militia at your polling station, and that's literally what's being organized right now for our coming election. It's pretty scary. But anyway, after 82, a lot of the poll watching died down, but then it really brought back up in 2008 through the Tea Party, because although the Republican parties were banned from poll watching, independent parties could still, were still allowed to. So I'm gonna read this. Mariah Blake writes this article quote. She says, "Conservative anti-voter fraud fervor first arose around the same time as two turning points in American politics. The first was John F. Kennedy's narrow presidential win in 1960, which many Republicans attribute to voter fraud in Illinois and Texas. The second was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, by banning discriminatory voting practices, stoked fear in some quarters about the rising power of black voters. During the run-up to the 1964 presidential election, the Republican National Committee launched Operation Eagle Eye, the nation's first large-scale anti-voter fraud campaign. As part of the program, the RNC recruited tens of thousands of volunteers to show up at polling places, mostly in inner cities, and challenge voters' eligibility, using a host of tools and tactics, including cameras, two-way radios, and calls to Republican-friendly sheriffs. So, so essentially, one of the, points. I mean, the Koch brothers were really big on pushing this narrative that there's a huge issue with voter fraud in our country, and that we have to, push a lot of voter suppression methods to ensure the integrity of our election. In reality, voting fraud is like 0.00001%. I mean, there's a handful, it happens a handful of times every year out of out of 120 or so million voters. In most of those cases, it's usually by mistake, or if it's done by felons who don't realize that they've lost their right to vote, and things like that. And very few times there's actually people trying to commit voter fraud. So this is a non-issue, but at the same time, it's a justification. If the Republicans make an issue, they can justify their voter suppression, which we're going to talk about in their section, is a foundational component of the Republican Party as voter suppression, including big Republican donors like Koch brothers, who they did a huge campaign through all their Astroturfs, pushing this voter fraud myth, and really stoked up a lot of fear, where Tea Party organizations like this one called True the Vote organized, in almost every state in this country, organized thousands of people to go into these black communities and to the black polling stations and intimidate voters, to comb through the public records of voters and try to find any kind of discrepancy, like they spelled their name slightly wrong on one form and another. They can trigger these remediation, voter remediation barriers, which causes additional identity checks and additional proofs of addresses and all this stuff that sounds legitimate until you realize that a lot of people don't have time or means to do all this, or they don't realize this is happening until they show up and try to vote and realize that it's too late to register. So they're huge on repressing the votes in 2010 and basically every election up until this one, where now the Republican Party is going to, they're passing the reins to the Republican Party in a sense. So True the Vote, read this New York Times article about it. Wrote, True the Vote, now active in 30 states, hopes to train hundreds of thousands of poll watchers to make the experience of voting like driving and seeing the police following you, as one of the group's leaders put it. Not surprisingly, the group is also active in voter ID movement with similar goals. These activities present a real danger to the fair administration of elections and to the fundamental freedom to vote. As a recent report by Common Cause and Demos put it, And then we read this. New York Times also wrote, a Tea Party group, True the Vote, descends on large minority precincts and combs the registration records for the slightest misspelling or address error. It uses this information to challenge voters at the polls, and through almost every challenge is baseless. The arguments and delays frustrate those in line and reduce turnout. The thing that's different from the days of overt discrimination is the phony pretext of combating voter fraud. Voter identity fraud is all but non-existent, but the assertion that it might exist is used as an excuse to reduce the political rights of minorities, the poor, students, older Americans, and other groups that tend to vote Democratic. So yeah, I mean, we're going to see a huge right-wing poll watching campaign like we've never seen before this coming election, unfortunately. And then I'm going to leave this. I'm going to play this clip from The Newsroom, which is a fictional show, but and it's a very interesting fictional show because it's about this newscaster who's, he's like a conservative newscaster that that basically has a change of heart during the rise of the Tea Party movement and starts trying to report accurately on them. And what's interesting about the show is like every name they talk about, every politician they talk about, all the clips they do were actual real things, actual real quotes by politicians, real clips of it's just the show itself was a fiction, but in its way it actually captured a lot of the rise of the Tea Party, particularly in the first season. So I'm gonna play this one quick clip where he starts talking about the Tea Party, yeah, I'll just play it for you. Again, this is fiction, take what you want from it, but everything, all the things they talk about and the people they talk about are all real and actually happened.
The Tea Party believes in loving America, but hating Americans. Tea Party Congressman Alan West of Florida. I must confess, when I see anyone with an Obama bumper sticker, I recognize them as a threat to the gene pool. They believe in loving America, but hating its government. Conservative activist Grover Norquist.
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
And they believe that anyone who disagrees with the Tea Party has sinister anti-American motives.
The objective of the liberals is to destroy this country. The objective of the liberals is to make America mediocre.
Most of all, you must never, under any circumstance, seek to reach a compromise with your opponent, or do any of what Democrats and genuine Republicans both call governing. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama the second term.
And one other plank in the Tea Party platform. If you're poor, it means you're either too lazy or too stupid to be rich. Here's Andre Bauer, Tea Party leader and Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. My grandmother was not a highly educated woman, but she told me as a small child to quit feeding stray animals. You know why? Because they breed. It's almost hard to believe Republicans can't get Dorothy Cooper to vote for them. During Tea Party rallies and campaign speeches, we've been told that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that if the Founding Fathers were here today, they'd tell us so. Here's John Adams in the Treaty of Tripoli. As the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. And here's Thomas Jefferson. That our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions. And here's the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What's more frightening than the perversion of our great history is that sensible, smart, strong Republicans, the very men and women who should be standing up to radical fundamentalism, are so frightened of losing primary battles to religious zealots that they've thrown in the towel on sanity. So we get this.
Yes, the Constitution established the United States of America as a Christian nation.
It's ironic because the biggest enemy of the phony Republican isn't Nancy Pelosi or Harry Reid or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. It's this man. He said, heal the sick, feed the hungry, care for the weakest among us, and always pray in private. Ideological purity, compromise is weakness. A fundamentalist belief in scriptural literalism, denying science, unmoved by facts, undeterred by new information, a hostile fear of progress, a demonization of education, a need to control women's bodies, severe xenophobia, tribal mentality, intolerance of dissent, and a pathological hatred of the U.S. government. They can call themselves the Tea Party, they can call themselves conservatives, and they can even call themselves Republicans, though Republicans certainly shouldn't. But we should call them what they are, the American Taliban. And the American Taliban cannot survive if Dorothy Cooper is allowed to vote.
Terry Smith's coming up next with the Capitol Report. This is Newsnight. I'm Will McAvoy. Good night.